massive welcome to Alison Arnot as well, our speaker this afternoon. I'm going to introduce Alison shortly, but I'm very mindful in these situations I probably need to speak slowly for the first 60 seconds just to give everyone a chance to sign up, join in, as it were. And actually, unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of people sign up for this webinar this afternoon. I am really fascinated, as I'm sure you will be, to hear what Alison has to say. I think it's a really interesting topic. So, but whilst we're waiting, actually, just very briefly before I introduce Alison, just to say, I say I'm Andrew Harvey, Chief Executive of VMA Group. Some of you might know VMA Group well, some of you less so. This might be the first time you've connected with VMA Group, or equally you might have known us for a long time. Just as a bit of a brief intro whilst we're waiting for everyone, VMA Group actually turns 48 in November this year. So VMA Group has been around a long old time, and effectively we are a communications and marketing recruitment and executive search firm. Well, that's what we were established to be nearly 50 years ago. Since then, actually, we've broadened our service a little bit more into the realms of such things such as org design consultancy or ED&I consultancy, professional training, development and coaching, and those sorts of things. And actually, one of the things that VMA Group has done for almost those 50 years of its existence is to run lots of different events for all of the people that we have in our network. And actually, that is where the idea of our Meet the Author series came from. We wanted to do something that we felt would add value to the people in our network. And I am a passionate, strong believer in the value of continued professional development. And so a couple of years ago, the idea was born of the Meet the Author series, where we would bring brilliant authors together like Alison, absolute experts in the field that had written a book. And actually, we would help facilitate knowledge sharing, I suppose, amongst this community, and it would be a great way to support professional development for those people that were part of our network. And that's really what we're doing here today. And we are here to discuss Alison's book, which has the title of Internal Communication in Times of Crisis. And just to say, you can purchase this book, and you can purchase it from the Kogan website. That's Kogan. And Alison has very kindly provided a discount code, which is Alison Arnot 25. I say we are recording this. You can listen back to that, but we will also be sharing an email after this webinar, and we'll have further information about how you can buy the book and get the discount on that as well. So enough from me. I'm sure we've now got everyone on the call, hopefully. So Alison, thank you again. Perhaps we can kick off by you giving us a little introduction about yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrew, for having me. My name's Alison Arnot. I'm the director of a company called Catalyst Communications. I'm an internal and external communications consultant and trainer specializing in internal communications, crisis communications, and internal crisis communications. My passion is training. I train hundreds of delegates a year through my own business and through other organizations. But I've got 25 years experience working in public relations, delivering campaigns. I've worked in higher education sector. I've worked in the aviation sector. I've worked in the rail industry. I've worked in financial services. And then for the past 12 years, obviously, I've been working with multiple different organizations through my consultancy organization.
Brilliant. So clearly, a lot of experience there, Alison, gained, and lots to share with us this afternoon. Just a couple of household points. So feel free to keep your cameras on. I'm very happy for this to be a sort of an interactive session. If you have questions, as is the case, put them in the chat. We'll try and manage those throughout the conversation if they are time relevant to where we are with Alison, but also we'll try and pick up on some questions at the end as well. And I say, if we can make it interactive, then we'll do that. As I say, it's also being recorded and you can look back. So just a reminder on that. So thank you, Alison, for the introduction. I am mindful that we've got lots that we could talk about, and probably not enough time to cover everything that you know or that is in your book. But I did want to pull out some particular questions which I think are probably relevant to highlight, and also highlight relevant parts in your book. But before we do that, I suppose I wanted to ask you the first question, actually, because there may be some other budding authors amongst us, or certainly other budding communications authors, potentially. Can I ask the first question? What inspired you to write this book, and why did you write it? Why has it been written now or in 2025?
Great question. I have been interested in this subject for a long, long time. Um, Originally, my interest was based on experience. So I was involved, for example, in the Glasgow airport terror attack very, very early in my career. And then I was involved in other crisis situations as I moved into different roles and became even more interested in it and begun to specialize in it later in my career. But even from those really early days, I kind of recognized the importance of leadership and communication. Glasgow Airport was a great example of very, very positive leadership, very supportive leadership, very, very strong, planned, prepared communication. But there were other organizations that I worked in or worked with where that was lacking slightly. And I began to see there's a huge disconnect here between how well we do, how quickly we recover, how able we are to bring people together when communication and leadership are strong. So I started to become interested in the subject for myself. I didn't plan to write a book on it at all.
Right.
And I was consulting and I was training more and more on this subject. And I was talking about how we need to consider internal communication alongside external communication, which is what we kind of traditionally did. And I was doing a lot of reading myself. I was making a lot of notes myself. And what I began to observe, particularly as we kind of moved through COVID, and I recognized that there was slightly more demand for the training that I was offering in this field. The reading that I was doing myself to kind of back up this training, reinforce the training, it was either very academic, although interesting and helpful, and the academic insights have definitely shaped my practice. But it was either very academic and hard to kind of say, well, what does this mean for me right now? Or it was very, very superficial. And it was that kind of, here's 4 very obvious things that you need to do, but we're not going to tell you how to do them or why to do them or when to do them or what the nuances are. So I was looking for something in the middle.
Yeah.
And I realized recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, that the time was right to kind of present this in a more packaged way, partly to claim my own knowledge and experience and work in this field, but more than that, to kind of help others who were moving through the path that I'd gone through myself earlier in my career. So it was a long-standing idea, but the timing just felt right for me when I began to approach publishers and decide to write it.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm sure maybe there'll be other people listening in that are inspired by that, and they may also feel they've got a book in them.
Yeah.
But I can understand, your experience and the timing and the sort of professional journey that you've been on has helped you. I mean, it makes sense in terms of your experiences. So it's good to have that context. So thank you for that. So just in terms of the book, there's lots of different chapters in there. They pick up on all sorts of different things. But I wanted to pull out, as I say, some of the key highlights and some of the key questions that relate to those that I think are particularly interesting. And one of those actually was around what to do before a crisis even hits. Because I guess that's one of the important questions. There's a lot in the book about what you should do when a crisis happens, but actually before the crisis hits, in terms of preparation, what do you think? What does your experience tell you? What does the book tell you about what people should do before a crisis
Yeah.
actually happens?
It's a brilliant question, actually. I'm so glad you asked it, because often when people think about crisis communications, they think about that acute moment of crisis, the moment the ship sinks, the building explodes, whatever it is happens. But actually, a lot of crisis can be seen long before they actually happen. And internal crisis communications, I believe, is not just about covering up or kind of making excuses for what happened, but it's actually about preventing harm. It's about disclosing what happened and helping strengthen the people inside the organization and the organization itself as a result of that. So a lot of that work begins early. If we want to prevent harm, we need to be really aware what the red flags are within the organization, what the risks are, how they might play out, and how we can use communication and culture to kind of enable the best possible way forward and to to kind of prevent harm. So crisis communication is not just about the moment it hits. Prevention happens before with listening, with building psychologically safe cultures where people feel safe to observe and report and tackle issues and potential problems of all different shapes and sizes. It involves listening within the organization. It involves scenario planning, training, channel readiness, and so on. So there's so much more that can be done, first of all, to stop a crisis from happening through the use of internal comms, which I think is not really understood as well as it could be yet, but getting to be better understood, as well as preparing to support and enable your people inside the organization when the crisis actually does strike.
Yeah. I've got a bit of a side question for you here, just put you on the spot a little bit. Just based on the conversations you've had, the people you've met, what's your guess in terms of percentage of internal comms teams that have prepared for a crisis before the crisis even hits? Are we sort of 50-50, or, as an industry, are people kind of 75% prepped and ready to go, or where do you think it's at?
It's really interesting. I can only go on my own observations through consultancy training and kind of talking to people in kind of situations like this. But what I tend to find is people will say they're prepared, but actually that preparation, particularly for internal comms, is fairly superficial. So they may have, and lots of organizations have really robust external crisis comms plans, and particularly in the kinds of sectors where crises happen more often. Some sectors are more prone to crisis than others for various different reasons, and some parts of the world are more prone. So those organizations often have robust crisis plans or business contingency plans in place, but they don't necessarily give a lot of detail as to how they will support and enable the internal audience. It's just, don't forget to send the press release, or, don't forget to put out an email, or let's get everyone together for a meeting. Actually, internal crisis communication is much more nuanced than that. It's much more long-term. It's a strategic discipline that enables us to connect with the organization's objectives and kind of consider what we will need to communicate, how and when, and in different scenarios, and what our contingencies will be as the crisis evolves. And in my experience, very few organizations have that level of preparation yet. That's my hope, that we all start getting better at it and those numbers really, really rise.
Yeah. Indeed, I'm sure that is probably the case, but I think it's definitely, certainly from a VMA Group perspective, it's one of those things that perhaps crops up more and more these days, and I think it is something, therefore, that people might plan for more effectively in the future. So that's great. So we've talked about what to do before a crisis hits. I can imagine that when a crisis does hit, I have this picture in my head that the crisis hits an organisation, the CEO calls a meeting any day of the week or any time of the day. You're called into the boardroom. They look at you and say, we've got an issue. We need to communicate now, and this is what we need to say. But actually, the question is, are they right? So my question to you is, what do you say back to them? When a crisis happens, how quickly should you communicate as an organisation? Should it be instantly, or do you need to take a certain amount of time? And actually, what are the first things that you should probably say? What are those first messages? And is there any commonality, I suppose, across different organizations, irrespective of what that crisis might be? So how quickly, and what do you say in the first instance? What are your thoughts on that?
Speed is really important. Particularly, the nature of a crisis means it's not business as usual. And many definitions of crisis talk about the fact that a crisis is something that's going to cause harm. So it could be human harm, it could be operational harm, it could be environmental harm, it could be financial harm, it could be reputational harm. If you want to avoid harm, you need to communicate quickly. And there's lots of research in external crisis communications or traditional crisis communications, which talks about stealing thunder. The quicker that an organization communicates, the more able it is reputationally to bounce back. And it makes sense, actually, that the more quickly it communicates, the more able people are to act, and so therefore to kind of help the organization to bounce back. So to my mind, it's not just a reputational issue, it's also an operational issue. That applies internally in internal crisis communication, because organizations have internal reputations as well as external reputations. But more than that, with a crisis, they have a very high power, high interest stakeholder group in their employees. Their employees know the crisis in more detail, they feel it, they deal with it in more detail than many of the external stakeholders. So the quicker that we can communicate with them, the quicker we reduce harm. The problem that some organizations have is they say, but we don't know what to say. We're worried about making it worse. We haven't got the perfect answer yet. And my advice would be that doesn't really matter. You need to disclose what you know. The very fact that we're here in this room means that we know something. So we need to disclose, given, the obvious kind of legal obligations and obligations of duty of care to certain individuals and so on. We need to disclose what has happened and what people need to do about it. What do our employees need to do? And in those first instances, it's about protecting from harm. So what do we know? What we don't yet know, where information might come from, when the next update will come. But we want to show that the organization is confident, it's competent, it's caring, it's in control. So we potentially want to express concern for what's happened. We want to show that we're taking action. We want to give people instructions to keep themselves and others safe. We want to reassure them that we're going to keep them updated as the crisis evolves.
Okay. I think that is a question that a lot of people are going to have wondered, I think. So I think what you've talked about there, I think is very helpful. I guess one of the challenges always be the strength of pushback or challenge you get from your exec team or from the CEO if they've got a particularly different point of view. But I think at least it's powerful to have your own very strong view.
Yeah. And actually, that's where the training comes in. The more training you can do in advance, the more that you can do a bit of scenario planning and help your leadership team to see the benefits of speedy, clear, visible communication. Yeah. Some organizations also have kind of like a statement of intent when a crisis happens. So they'll say, when a crisis happens, this is our approach to communication. We will communicate quickly. We will be transparent. That's super helpful for comms teams in the heat of the moment when the leadership team says, I know we thought we might do this, but should we really? We can bring the policy forward and say, we should, and this is why.
Yeah. And actually thinking about training as a concept, as it were, and learning and that sort of stuff, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you, in your book, I mean, there's so much in your book. It's a brilliant book. There's so much in there, but you have a really useful 7-stage model for managing internal comms in a crisis, which I think is brilliant. Everyone loves a model. It just gives everyone something to hang their approach on. Maybe it's something that you can use to train or explain, for the senior people that you're trying to convince in terms of things that you should do. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what that 7-stage model is and perhaps summarize some of those stages for us just now?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so the model is something that I have observed time and time again when I've been in crisis situations or when I've been talking to crisis situations. And often within organizations, leaders are thinking about, in the panic of the moment, how do we get the organization back up and running without really thinking about what do people need? So my aim with the model was to help people take a more considered, more intentional approach from recognizing whatever type of crisis, whatever type of harm is felt, whether it's a terror attack, a cyber incident, an issue of misconduct, people will feel shock. They'll feel discomfort. They'll feel kind of dysregulated almost. So what we want to do is we want to move them from a state of shock to a state of stability, then action, then advocacy. And we also want to make sure that we're baking care and, human consideration and empathy into our approach from the outset, not just because that's the right thing to do, but also because it's something that will enable people to kind of come around and support the organization later. If we're not caring for people, if we're not listening to them, if we're not showing empathy, they may be more likely to resist what it is the organization's saying. So if we want to build up trust, if we want to build up advocacy, if we want to build up support to enable the organization to recover, my view is we need to meet human needs first and then organizational needs. So I created this 7S of internal crisis communication, and I'll tell you what they are and then I'll explain it. The 7S are surviving, supporting, sense making, stabilizing, stimulating, sustaining, and strengthening. And they're key human and organizational needs that I believe must be addressed, and they should be addressed in that order, although you can run them in parallel and go backwards and forwards. You at least consider them in that order for the organization to move from shock to strengthening. So the first three needs, surviving, supporting, and sense making, they're the human needs. They come first. You can deal with them all in a matter of hours, or it may take weeks, it may take months. In some really traumatic crisis, it may take even years. But basically, what that is surviving communication to prevent harm. In a terror attack, it may be about where people need to go to keep safe. In a cyber incident, it may be about, don't click on this link or whatever. But the communication is simple, clear, and directive to stop the harm from growing. Immediately after that, we move into support. What help practically, emotionally, psychologically do people need to be able to start functioning in this situation? And again, that's different in a cyber incident than it is to a terror incident, to an earthquake, to a Me Too type situation. So it's about understanding the situation and recognizing that in different scenarios, different support needs are required. But we meet them and we keep talking to people through our communication. Then we move into sense making. This is really important, and it's not something that organizations do particularly well. When a crisis strikes, an organization may well write a press release, forward it to their teams. But what they don't recognize is at this moment, their teams are thinking about the crisis. Why did this happen? Whose fault was it? Why was it caused? What is everybody doing now? How do I feel about it? How do I feel about myself within this situation? How do I feel about the organization? What am I going to say and do next? If we want people to act and advocate, we need them to sense make in a positive way. So that means a press release isn't enough, because one, it kind of signals to the internal community, you're less important to us than our external stakeholders, but two, it doesn't meet their unique needs. So sense making is all about accepting that when a crisis strikes, people will gather information from lots and lots of different sources. It's about recognizing that they'll visit it time and time again and turn it over as they make decisions. And it's about recognizing the organization needs to be present and active in that conversation. One piece of content isn't enough. It's about enabling people to come together and to talk and to decide how they feel about the situation that's evolving. Once you've met those first three needs, you can then move into the organizational needs. And as I said, that process can be very, very quick in a kind of minor crisis, or it can be more long-term in a very traumatic, very harmful crisis. But once people have protected from harm, feeling supported, starting to make sense of what's happening, we can begin to stabilize the organization. And stabilizing communication is just about confirming what's happened, what support is available, and what people need to do next. Then we move into stimulation, involving people in the crisis response, getting them to a position where they're able to participate in the organization again and take on the roles that they need to take on as part of this crisis recovery process. Then, if you've been involved in crisis yourself, you'll know they're long, they're exhausting. There comes a point in the crisis recovery where our motivation dips. We get tired. Some people face burnout. If we are not recognizing and supporting people through that low dip of the crisis, our recovery can stall. So Sustaining information is important as well. It's about recognizing milestones, pinpointing successes, involving everyone, saying thank you where it's appropriate. Now, sustaining information is tricky because there are some crises where people do not want to see you celebrating success when significant harm has been felt. So it needs to be carefully considered, but it's about showing people that progress is being made and they're recognized for the part that they're playing in that progress. And then finally, we have strengthening, where the organization is kind of starting to move back into business as usual or a new normal. I do believe that in many types of crisis, if an organization can show that it's learned, if it can show that lessons have been implemented, then it can actually emerge stronger. There's information and stories out just now about Marks and Spencer's, for example, having experienced a terrible cyber attack only a few months ago, actually seeing improved business results. Glasgow Airport, again, the first crisis that I was involved in, had hugely positive reputational bounce after the crisis because of the way that it was seen to deal with it. So we can strengthen, but again, that needs to be intentional through communication and so on.
I think that is super helpful. I speak to a lot of people and have done over the last 20 years or so that are at different stages in their comms career. Some people have more experience of this than others, obviously some far less so. But actually, I think what I love about this is, irrespective of the experience that you have, it is a great model which anyone can take and use at any point in their career.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be relevant to the organization they work in, whether that's an oil and gas firm or a financial services business or, something completely different. It's a super easy to use model and probably will help people explain what's going to happen to the other stakeholders in the room in terms of a best practice approach for that communication. So I think it is a super helpful. I mean, I sense check this with you. I suppose this is relevant for any particular organization, right? You don't see this changing.
No, I believe so, and that's what I wanted to achieve. So thank you. That was the impact I wanted to have. I wanted to have a tool that could be applied. Obviously, there's nuance. Obviously, people need to approach it with judgment, consideration, curiosity, all of these different things. But it's a tool that can guide anyone at any stage of their career, in any type of sector, and in any type of crisis. The way that it's applied is obviously different in an earthquake than it is in a cyber attack, but the process is the same. And that's what I wanted to provide to people.
Yeah. So I suppose the next question is, then we've talked about what you might do before a crisis. We've talked about this brilliant model. And, at this point, we've got a lot of people that have got very robust plans in terms of how they're going to manage this stuff. But we all know even the best made plans can go awry. So I'm wondering, in your experience, what do you think people tend to get wrong when they are managing internal comms in a crisis situation? Even with the best plans, what are the key things that people should look out for that they often, or their peers may get wrong and they might want to avoid?
Yeah. Well, you say even with the best plans, you're right. The number one thing people get wrong is they don't make plans. They fail to prepare. But if they have made plans, they can still get things wrong. And that can be when there's a wobble at the top of the organization. And perhaps we have that conversation we were talking about before about not communicating quickly enough. People wanting to stall the communication for whatever reason. And that can be because they have caused the crisis themselves, because they're feeling guilty, because they don't want to be found out. There's all sorts of reasons, or it could just be a lack of confidence, a fear of making things worse. There's many, many different reasons why people might panic and freeze in that moment and freeze at the point when they need to communicate. Not communicating quickly is the biggest mistake that you can make, because someone else leads the conversation. And that may be someone who's spreading mis and disinformation. It could be someone who's spreading a different agenda. It could be someone who simply doesn't understand what's going on but has a loud voice. And so therefore, if the organization wants to control the situation, support people, And importantly, the point I always come back to, minimize harm, they need to speak quickly. The next mistake they make is they don't think about the crisis as a long-term process. So they think, okay, let's get that message out. Everything's going to be fine. It's not, because people have ongoing evolving needs. And that's partly why I created the framework that we've just talked about, to help people think forward and recognize we're going to have to meet different needs at different crisis points. And there are different approaches, messages, tactics, and so on that we're going to have to take while we're doing this. And then the third thing I think is not including everyone in the crisis response, and in particular line managers. So
Right.
kind of sending out central messages, but not enabling the people within the organization to interpret and share those messages on their term. And that's, again, something that I talk about a lot in my training and consultancy, why that's important.
Mm. And actually, that's something I was going to pick up on. Actually, a quick side question, just to put you on the spot again, actually, just thinking about this. Yeah, do you think, I mean, I'm guessing, this book is obviously about internal comms in a crisis situation, and most of the people on here, I'm sure, therefore, will have a responsibility for internal comms. But you yourself are incredibly experienced across communications as a discipline. Would it be fair to say that people who have an external comms remit or background are more prepared than people that have an internal comms remit, or is that not the case in terms of your experience or research? Just as a
It
side question.
varies. It varies sector by sector, but people
Right.
who are focused on external comms, and particularly media relations, although increasingly social media and public affairs, have more tools to guide them. I
Right.
think I have possibly, hopefully, created the first tools, helpful tools for internal crisis communicators. So that's taking things forward. But traditionally, I don't know whether they're more prepared. I know as an internal communicator, for example, I was always involved in crisis planning, and when I was in-house in organizations, part of the on-call team,
Mm.
etc., which led to my early crisis experiences, which then further developed my interest. But there's definitely more tools to help external, or there has been in the past, hopefully not now.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting to say. Just some people may rightly or wrongly make that assumption. So it's
Mhm.
interesting to hear your thoughts. But I want to come back to one of the things that you mentioned. You mentioned, I think you used the word line managers or leaders. And I'm sure for anyone listening, and including for myself, I always think, 20 years working in comms and comms recruitment, if I had a pound coin for every time someone mentioned the word line manager or leader, I'd be a very rich, happily retired recruitment CEO. So it is definitely a topic of conversation. And I think the question is around what I suppose leaders and line managers have a massive role in terms of communicating and engagement, and I'm guessing even more so in a time of crisis. But I mean, on that point, what role should leaders specifically play in a time of crisis from an internal comms perspective? And
Mhm.
is that something very different to this kind of BAU role that they should play?
Yeah. Yeah, it is actually, because a crisis isn't BAU. So leadership is not, in a crisis, is not BAU either. The most important thing a crisis leader can do is set the standard for other people to follow. So they need to be clear about not just what has happened and disclose the crisis and all the things that we've talked about, but how they expect people to act. And they need to role model that behavior. They also need to embed a level of confidence, competence, and so on within the organization by being very visible, by listening, by being very non defensive as they try to come to terms with fixing the crisis, because obviously crisis leaders have a crisis communication role, but they also have a crisis management role. So they have a dual role, whereas we tend to be focused on communication. So they need to be very encompassing of the organization and listening to people as they kind of enable people to function in the organization and then to act within the crisis scenario. So the leaders are critical. Without them, we've seen it. We don't even need to talk about organizations. We've seen it in real life. When the leadership is poor, COVID, for example, chaos follows. When the leadership is strong, the response is stronger as well.
And do you think there's anything specifically then that you can do to equip and support managers in a crisis situation? Obviously, there's lots of training that you give managers in terms of communications, but is there something specific that you would do to equip them and get them ready for,
Yeah, yeah,
crisis
absolutely.
response?
And it's slightly different for leaders and line managers because they have a different perspective on the crisis. So the leaders have
Right.
a lot of involvement, a lot of control, but the line managers potentially have a lot of detailed knowledge of the issues, of what's needed to fix it or what caused the problem in the first place. So there's slightly different kind of approaches that we need to take with the leadership team. It's about emboldening them with the confidence to be visible and helping them shape those central messages, um, and giving them the confidence to enable everyone to come forward and to trust everyone to come forward. With the line managers, it's different because leaders are trained for this type of thing, or they should be. Line managers often aren't. Line managers often aren't even trained to be good people managers, let alone good crisis communicators. So we need to recognize they're coming at this from a different perspective. Um, and we need to give them the training. We need to give them the tools to do the job, whether that be, FAQs or conversation starters or PowerPoints or and so on. But we also need to give them the time to kind of absorb the information that we're asking them to pass on and the trust to be able to interpret that and deliver it in a way that's going to work for their teams. One of the biggest mistakes that organizations make with crisis comms when they do think they're involving leaders and line managers well is they say, okay, we've got this PowerPoint presentation or we've got these talking points, we need to cascade them through the organization, but we don't want the managers to interpret them in too much detail because this is a crisis and we're trying to deeply control it. So we're going to give them this PowerPoint and we want them to deliver it to their teams exactly as it's written. In that case, why give them the workload when they're already under so much crisis pressure and they have so much else to do? Deliver that centrally. If it really, and sometimes there is, if a message really can't be interpreted at all, if it must be delivered exactly as it's written, and there are instances for that, don't burden the line managers with delivery because delivery is much more than standing up in front of a room. It's the time and planning that takes to kind of get to that point where you're ready to do that. Deliver it from the leaders. We've got the technology now that enables us to kind of have leaders talk to everyone in the organization face to face through a digital platform such as this one. Use the line managers instead where they can add value, where they can take on that supporting role, where they can take on that sense making role, where they can have conversations with their teams, where they can enable people to function and thrive within the situation that they face. And very often that doesn't come from a PowerPoint. So we need to equip them to be able to do that in a more meaningful way.
I mean, one of the things I always think of, I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on leaders, and people are often quick to judge and criticize leaders in a crisis situation. But it's never lost on me that those leaders are also just human beings at the end of the day, and they might feel incredibly nervous about the crisis. They might feel incredibly stressed or uncomfortable or unsafe, and that's something that some people forget too easily, but perhaps we shouldn't forget. I mean, just on that point, is there something specific that you might do to coach leaders that are also impacted by the crisis, but yet still trying to reassure people that everything's, say okay or under control, but that things are being managed?
Yeah.
Leaders that are really struggling. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question again, and every leader is different, and every leader is a human being. So some will be, really up for crisis leadership. They will thrive in it, and others will struggle. So it's about listening to them. It's about showing them that you're a safe space, that your intention is to support them and to prevent harm, and to support the other stakeholders of the organization to help the organization to survive. You need to show them that you are strategically aware of the organization and its objectives, but you're also the comms expert. And so the advice that you're giving them is helpful advice, So give them perhaps the tools to shape information, give them the tools to answer questions, get out and about with them if that gives them comfort, talk to them about the conversations they're having, encourage them to ask questions, help them reflect on crises that they've been involved in before or situations they've experienced, and talk about the benefits of being visible, talk about the benefits of being interested, talk about the benefits of being empathetic and active in the crisis response. But also a really important thing, and something that I do a lot in my training and consultancy, is help them play it forward. So help them understand, okay, if I make this decision now, what does it mean next week, next month, next year? Because what your leaders don't want is they don't want to be in that situation where they're sitting around the morning breakfast table with their family and explaining to the family why they made a decision that perhaps feels, in the cold light of day, a little bit unethical or uncaring. Or they don't want to be opening up the newspapers and seeing their face. They don't want to be that. We've seen this week that we're recording the picture of Prince Andrew in the back of the car. They don't want to be that person. If you don't want to be that person, don't do anything yourself that's going to make it happen. So the more we can help them understand that, the more we can help them to make good decisions early. And that is good crisis leadership as well.
Yeah. And then building on that, there is a really, I think, interesting, important chapter in the book, actually, which talks about, I think that the phrase is taking care of yourself. So actually building on this point about, sometimes leaders themselves struggle in a crisis situation, actually, it's not going to be easy for the internal comms leader either. So, stress, demand, criticism, you can just imagine when something goes wrong, the challenges that comms leader or IC leader has to juggle, and therefore, as you say, taking care of themselves is really important. But why did you feel it was relevant to include that chapter, and is there anything you'd highlight specifically that you think
Yeah,
would be relevant?
again, it comes from my own experience.
Right.
When crisis happens, people are not at their best. People can make decisions. People can be rude. They can be aggressive. They can be very persuasive as they try to encourage you to do things that might not be against your own values. I've been lucky to have brilliant crisis leadership. I've worked with brilliant crisis leaders, particularly, as I've said, at Glasgow, which was my first experience. I've also worked with crisis leaders who've made it a little bit more difficult, or unintentionally. I remember when I worked in the university sector, there was a major crisis ongoing, and I was working incredibly hard throughout the process. My gran had had a stroke, and she died during the kind of acute phase of the crisis. And I remember being asked to come to a meeting at 5 p.m. on the day of the funeral. I was already giving everything that I had and more, and I did it. And I didn't actually question it at the time. And it was only afterwards I thought, there was some performative gestures there in terms of I got a nice card from the leadership team, how sorry we are that your grand's passed away. And I may even have got flowers, I can't remember now, it was a while ago. But afterwards I thought, surely someone else could have stepped in to that meeting. And so there are things like that we forget to advocate for ourselves because we're so focused on what we're doing for other people. And I wanted to make it clear that we need to protect ourselves and we need to protect others. There are far worse situations than that. That was, for me, a memorable situation, but nobody was cruel or unkind or toxic towards me in that situation. I've heard of other people who've worked in crises, and I spoke to some off the record for the book where they've worked in really toxic environments where they've been pressured to do things, or they felt bullied or harassed within the crisis situation. That makes things so much worse. And again, we don't need to put up with that. Our job is not to cover up for someone else's mistake. As communicators, we rarely cause the crisis ourselves. Occasionally, we can make it worse by communicating poorly, but we rarely cause the problem in the first place. So taking on that burden and feeling a need to cover up something for someone else is not what our job is. Our job is to explain what happened, to disclose what happened, and to talk about what's being done to fix it. We should have support available and backup available to help us when that burden becomes really intense. And I think that is a real issue that I've seen time and time again, or I've heard people talk about. And I felt it was important to tackle it because, I say the book was written for me and for people like me at different stages in my career. And yes, the tools are important. The strategy is important, but that emotional confidence is important as well. And so I felt it was important to include that in the book.
I think it's a really important point, and I think about it from my perspective and insight as well, is that, if you're doing a brilliant job and you're going through this period of stress and crisis, actually for the benefit of you and the organization, it's really important that you come out safely the other side and you
Yeah.
remain with the business for the longer term. You say some of these crises last for a long period of time. So I think you say, for the benefit of everyone, it's really important that you do take time to look after yourself. Otherwise, everything starts to go wrong for the organisation and other people. So I think it's a really crucially important part, and it's great to see that you highlighted that.
Yeah.
I think I'm sure that there are people scribbling things down as you're going through this stuff, Alison. If anyone's got any questions that they want to put into the chat, please do. And in a couple of moments' time, we will put some of those questions to Alison if we have some. I suppose a couple of final questions from me, Alison. We've covered a lot. I say it's a brilliant book. There's so much in there. It's impossible to go through it all today. But I suppose from your perspective, you had a load of experience, you were condensing it all down, you were sense checking. What's the most important thing that you learned whilst writing this book, do you think?
I think I learned a lot. Obviously, I spoke to some incredible people on and off the record while I was writing the book. One of the things that came back to me time and time again was that need for empathy. The power of empathy when we get it right and we mean it and we behave intentionally with compassion, how that can help heal wounds, but also how things can really be fractured and damaged when that's missing. That came to me time and time and time again. But another thing that I kind of learned is for more, I guess, for some of the people who may be aspiring to write their own book, is how powerful writing is for your own learning. I had all these ideas, I had all these notes, I had all these experiences, but being intentional about structuring them and putting them down, not just in a couple of notes for a training workshop or a PowerPoint slide, but a full book. I can't even remember how many words it was now, but 75,000 words or whatever it is, demands that you think about things in a different way. So the writing process is really, really helpful for your own learning. And I think personally as well, I suffer from imposter syndrome sometimes. I always try to do a good job. I'm always really aware of, doing my best and that kind of thing. And I remember just before the book was published, feeling a little bit of anxiety, kind of thinking, oh my God, these are my ideas. I'm putting them out there. What if people don't like them? What if people disagree with them? And so on. And one of the things I realized, I learned was, we need to be true to ourselves. It doesn't really matter what other people think or feel. They can write their own book and I can critique that. But that being intentional about sharing your experience, sharing your expertise, growing for yourself, putting yourself out there is a really powerful thing to keep doing at every stage of your career. And, particularly you get to my age, you find yourself in a real nice comfort zone. And sometimes it's important to push yourself out of that comfort zone a little bit and do something that might be difficult so that you can keep learning and developing as well.
Yeah. And I can completely understand how, distilling all of this stuff that you've learned, writing it all down, sense check, all of that sort of stuff helps you, really, I suppose, sense check and embrace all of these learnings and bring, develop this level of clarity then, particularly if you've got that imposter syndrome, when you are sat in the boardroom, when you are speaking to people, actually, do you know what? I know this stuff. I've learned it. I've written it down. I've sense checked it. I can see how it can really strengthen, solidify that experience and knowledge you have. So I suppose my final question is, given everything that we've covered today, what is the one thing that you would encourage people to take away from discussion? We've covered so much, but if there's one thing, what would be
Yeah.
that key thing?
Yeah, I think I've kind of touched on it already, but it's very, very important for people to understand crisis communication is not about hiding bad behavior. That is not what the job is for an ethical practitioner. It's about disclosing, preventing harm, enabling recovery. So we need to remember that crisis communication can be a force for good and a way for us to prevent harm or to minimize harm. But if we're going to do that, I think it's important that we recognize we need to prepare early. So the more reading you do in advance, the more training you do in advance, the more planning you do, the more conversations you have, the better equipped you'll be. We call it in crisis management muscle memory. You'll build that muscle memory, you'll build that confidence, and you'll be able to, advise strategically and meaningfully when things do get difficult in your organization.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we have got a couple of questions coming now. Actually, someone's made a really great point, Andrea, about the power of having examples, being able to say, look, this is what's happened at other organizations, giving case studies essentially to your stakeholders about what good and bad practice and outcomes look like. And I agree with that. I'm sure you will as well. It's a super powerful thing to be able to say,
Yeah.
well, this is what happened at M&S, this is what happened at P&O, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
I think that's really powerful. There's a really interesting question here on measurements. I think great question. How do you know whether your internal crisis communications response has worked? I mean, it's quite a broad question. It's an interesting
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
What are your
yeah.
thoughts on that briefly?
It is a broad question, and actually, there's a whole chapter in the book on measurement for that very reason. So, I'll try and answer quickly, but there's a lot to say about it. First and foremost, did the organisation recover? How did people feel about it? How do they feel about your organisation? And you can understand whether the organisation recovered by observing whether it met its crisis objectives and whether it's returned to business as usual, a new normal, or strengthened. But you want to understand how people felt about the messaging that you put out as well. And that happens at every point of the crisis. So very, very early in the crisis, our instincts would tell us we can't be measuring things. We can't be sending out surveys or holding focus groups when crisis is going on around us. We're not in business as usual. We don't know what is going on. But actually, you can do simple observations and simple measurements at every crisis stage. It may just not be measurement as normal, but we're not in business as normal. We're not in business as usual. So that is okay. The tools and techniques that you use are the same tools and techniques that you would use for other internal communications measurements. So you can use polls, you can use observation, you can use surveys, you can use focus groups, in-depth interviews. The list goes on, and sentiment analysis, all sorts of things like that. The secret is to be clear. What were our crisis objectives? And that's one thing, again, we haven't talked about too much today, but when you're developing your crisis strategy, you need to know what you want to achieve. What do you want people to think? What do you want people to feel? What do you want people to do in this crisis situation? So you need to have clear objectives, and then you need to measure those objectives to find out whether you achieved them and how people are feeling about your response generally, and your organization, of course.
Yeah, another helpful answer there. So we've got one final question, interesting question from Eve, and I suppose I might ask you the question because we haven't got loads of time. So Eve's question is really about, you might have a plan, but obviously in this social media age in which we live, you can't control the public's point of view or reaction to a particular crisis as they see it. Is there anything in the book that talks about managing, I don't know, trying to manage like your Joe Public sort of response versus the reality of what you're trying to do?
There's not. The book is unique in the fact that it's focused on internal audiences,
Right.
employees, contractors, and so on. However, a lot of the learning from the book can be used to understand how we deal better with external stakeholders as well,
Yeah.
particularly directly affected external stakeholders. So one is you can't kind of make them think or feel something, but you can
Mhm.
enable them to make or think or feel something. So that's evidencing how the organization is staying true to its values, how it's looking after crisis victims, and and so on. The other thing is, as we've said before, getting involved in the conversation early and understanding people will have different needs at different crisis points. The more you can understand and meet those needs, regardless of who the needs belong to, the more able you will be to recover. So be involved in the conversation. Don't be afraid to shape it. Depending on the type of crisis, will depend on the tone and the type of approach you take. Sometimes people are quite creative in their crisis response. That works when there's no real human harm felt, when the crisis is more easy to recover from. Obviously, you don't take that kind of slightly more wacky crisis strategies when there's pain and there's harm and there's trauma. But again, you can assess, you can listen, and you can judge what are people wanting from us right now, and how do we provide it. And that applies to both internal and external audiences.
Yeah. And just in a 60-second response, because I'm mindful of your time and then we'll try and wrap up. There's a question here from Nina, which I think is an interesting one. Do you think, I think the question is really around, you know, any comms professional, have they got the ability to do this sort of stuff and manage crisis internal comms? Or do you think we're looking for particular skills or personality traits of particular internal comms people to be good at this stuff?
Um, Yeah, I mean, I think there are certain personality traits that make you better at it. Obviously, you need to be a good communicator in the first place. You need to be interested in people. You need to have levels of empathy. You also need to have quite a strategic mind, because if you're going to do it well, you need to be advising and operating at very senior level um, under really challenging situations. So you need to be comfortable with that, and you need to be able to do it. This isn't a career that you need to do. You choose to do it, and certain people really thrive in this career. They step up to it. They kind of they seek it out. Other people find themselves, as I did, in it, and realize actually this is interesting and it can be quite meaningful work. Um, if you're looking to become involved in this type of work, I would advise, do the training, do the reading, do get involved in conversations like this, and kind of embed yourself in organizations where crisis and crisis planning and crisis training is normal. So my career began in rail and aviation and kind of sectors like that, where it is part of the job, even if you don't expect to do it every day. So being involved with teams who work like that is a really helpful kind of practical way to learn, gain experience, and kind of get your foot in the door for that type of job as well.
Great. Well, we have covered so much today, and I wanted to say a huge thank you for all of that. I'm mindful again of the time that we have. Thank you, Alison, for joining, for sharing all of that insight. I think it's been super interesting. As I say, this is a topic that will be on the minds of many internal comms people and comms people more generally, and I think there'd be a huge amount of value in them having listened today and or reading your book as well. So thank you to that. Thank you for that. Thank you to everyone that's joined as well. I'm sure you have found it useful. I'm sure you've been scribbling down notes. But again, do check out the Kogan website for Alison's book. You can buy it. As I say, Alison has kindly given us a discount code, which is Alison Arnot 25. And please do reach out to Alison on LinkedIn. She'd be very happy to connect and share more info as well. Alison also runs her own consulting business, which is Catalyst Communications. You can find her online. You can find her on LinkedIn. We'll share more in an email after this call. And if you want further advice, if you want to do some work with Alison, if you'd be interested in getting some support from her, clearly she is an absolute expert in her field and an absolute delight to deal with as well and work with, I'm sure. So please do reach out to her. But thank you, Alison, and thank you to everyone that's listened. We will be running other Meet the Author series in the future. So hopefully, one way or another, we will see you all again soon. Many
Thank you
thanks.
so much. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.